Welcome back to my channel, and if you're new, hi, I'm Olivia. Serial killers are already disturbing, but there's something really disconcerting about kids who kill, and that's definitely the truth for Graham Young. Born in Neadsden in North London on September 7, 1947, his mother died of tuberculosis only 3 months after his birth. His father was so devastated by his wife's death, he sent Graham to live with his Aunt Minnie and her husband Jack, while Graham's older sister went to live with her grandparents. He spent the first 2 years of his life with his aunt and uncle, becoming very close to them, but his father remarried in 1950 and reunited the family again in St. Albans with his new wife Molly. Graham showed visible signs of distress at being separated from his aunt. When he was old enough to read, he favored nonfiction accounts of murder. A particular favorite of his was Dr. Crippen, the notorious poisoner who killed his wife. When he was a teenager, he developed a fascination with Adolf Hitler and took to wearing swastikas. He also read widely on occult, claiming knowledge of Wiccans and local covens, and trying to involve local children in bizarre occult ceremonies, which involved sacrificing a cat on one occasion. He went on to become a rather peculiar child. Solitary in his habits, he made no efforts to socialize with children his own age. Others felt uncomfortable in his presence, and he developed a fascination for poisons and their effects. Academically, his only interests were chemistry, forensic science, and toxicology, but the limited school coverage of these subjects forced him to advance his studies through extracurricular reading. His father encouraged him, even buying him a chemistry set, which absorbed his attention for hours on end. By the age of 13, Young's comprehensive knowledge of toxicology enabled him to convince local chemists that he was in fact 17, and he procured a dangerous quantity of the poisons antimony, digitalis, arsenic, and thallium. His first victim was a friend and classmate, Christopher Williams, who suffered an extended period of vomiting, painful cramps, and headaches due to Young administering a cocktail of poisons that left medical experts baffled. Williams survived because Young couldn't fully satisfy his scientific curiosity, since it was impossible to monitor his victim's illness when he was sick at home. So he decided to focus on a group to whom he had unlimited access to: his family. In 1961, he began to test his poisons on them. He began poisoning his stepmother Molly in February. She suffered vomiting, diarrhea, and excruciating stomach pain. Before long, his father Fred was also suffering with similar stomach cramps, debilitating him for days at a time. Young's father initially suspected that Young might be inadvertently harming the family by his careless use of his chemistry set at home, but Young denied the accusation. The possibility that he was deliberately poisoning the family was never considered, likely because Young himself fell violently ill on numerous occasions. But it remains unclear whether this was on purpose to avoid detection, it was just his curiosity about his own reactions to the poison, or if he had just been careless about which teacups he had put the poison in. In November of 1961, Winifred Young was served a cup of tea by her brother one morning, but found its taste so sour she took one mouthful before she threw it away. While on the train to work an hour later, she began to hallucinate, had to be helped out of the station, and was eventually taken to the hospital, where doctors came to the conclusion that she had somehow been exposed to the poisonous Atropa belladonna. Fred Young confronted his son, but Graham denied it and actually blamed Winifred, saying that she had used the teacups to mix shampoo. Unconvinced, Fred searched Graham's room but found nothing incriminating. Nevertheless, he warned his son to be more careful in the future. Of course, Young ignored this warning. The worst effects were on Molly Young. Where the other 3 family members' symptoms seemed to wax and wane, Molly's condition grew increasingly dire. Young was poisoning her with antimony, but it was taking a long time to kill her, so he switched to thallium to speed up the process the night before Easter Saturday, April 21st, 1962, the day she was found by her husband writhing in agony in the back garden of their home, with Young looking on in fascination. She was rushed to the hospital, where she died later that night. Her cause of death was determined to be a prolapse of a spinal bone, which is a symptom of antimony poisoning. But it wasn't looked into further because it was thought to be the result of a traffic accident she had been in, and she was cremated at Young's suggestion. Shortly afterwards, his father became seriously ill and was taken to the hospital, where doctors discovered he was suffering from antimony poisoning, and one more dose would have killed him. Young's aunt, who knew his fascination with chemistry and poisons, became suspicious, as did his science teacher, Mr. Hughes, who discovered several bottles of poison in Young's desk. He spoke to the school's headmaster about his concern, and together they contacted the police. Young was arrested on May 23, 1962, and he confessed to the attempted murder of his father, sister, and friend, but he couldn't be charged with murder of his stepmother because her remains couldn't be analyzed since she had been cremated. Young was assessed by 2 psychiatrists prior to his trial and diagnosed as suffering from personality disorder and schizophrenia. At just 14 years old, he was detained under the Mental Health Act in Broadmoor Hospital, an institution for patients with mental disorders who have committed offenses. He was the youngest inmate since 1885. The hospital order initially stipulated that he should be detained for at least 15 years. Incarceration didn't stop him from experimenting, though this time it was on staff and other inmates. Within weeks, an inmate, John Barrage, died by cyanide poisoning. Young claimed to have extracted cyanide from laurel bush leaves on the mental hospital grounds, but no one believed he could do that, so the death was recorded as a suicide. He continued to read widely about poisoning, although he began to keep his obsession increasingly well hidden when authorities made it clear that appearing less obsessed would speed up his release. It seemed to work. In June of 1970, after nearly 8 years in Broadmoor, the prison psychiatrist wrote to the Home Secretary to recommend his release, announcing that Young, quote, is no longer obsessed with poisons, violence, and mischief. In June of 1970, Young's doctors recommended that he be released, saying he was cured. Young celebrated by telling a psychiatric nurse that he intended to kill a person for every year he was locked up in Broadmoor. This comment was recorded on his file, but somehow never influenced their decision to release him. After being released from the hospital on February 4, 1971, now aged 23, he got in contact with his sister, Winifred, who seemed willing to forgive her brother, though his father was more reluctant. He moved into a hostel and got a job at John Hadley Laboratories, a photographic supply firm in Bovingdon, Hertfordshire. Young's prohibition officer never visited Young's home or place of work. His employers received references as part of Young's rehabilitation from Broadmoor, but were not informed of his past as a convicted poisoner. So when Young offered to make coffee and tea for his co-workers, they merely viewed it as a kind gesture. The company had numerous chemicals on site, but Young didn't need them. He went to London to stock up on antimony, Valium, and other poisons he used for his experiments. Soon a fellow hostel resident, Trevor Sparks, began exhibiting the familiar stomach pain and sickness. He survived, but it's rumored that another man Young befriended had developed similar symptoms, but felt such agony he took his own life, though a formal connection with Young was never made. This time, Young didn't limit himself to poisoning people he lived with. He began making tea laced with poison for his colleagues. Soon after he began work, his foreman Bob Eggle grew ill. It was mistaken for a local virus called the bone bug, but he was eventually admitted to the hospital where he died in agony on July 7, 1971. His cause of death was recorded as pneumonia. Soon, the sickness had swept through his workplace. Over the next few months, Young poisoned 7 other workers with varying poisons and doses. The workers' symptoms were sometimes severe enough to require hospitalization, and general absenteeism at Hadley increased dramatically. Various sources were considered, including water contamination, radioactive fallout, and leakage of the chemicals used at the firm itself. None were fatally poisoned, but that changed in September of 1971, when Fred Biggs began to suffer severe symptoms. He went to the hospital, but was too far gone to be saved. He suffered a horrible, drawn-out death, which actually frustrated Young, who wanted him to die faster. He even recorded his displeasure in his diary. Biggs eventually succumbed on November 19, 1971, becoming Young's 4th and final victim. At this point, it was evident that an investigation needed to happen, since 70 employees had recorded similar symptoms. Ultimately, it was Young who was his own downfall. He asked the company doctor why thallium poisoning wasn't being considered since it was used on site. Surprised and concerned by Young's in-depth knowledge of toxicology, the doctor reported this exchange to management, who then alerted the police. Soon, Young's criminal record was uncovered. Subsequent forensic inquiries revealed the thallium poisoning, the first recorded case of a deliberate poisoning by this heavy metal. Young was arrested on November 21, 1971. Police found a lethal dose of thallium in his pocket that Young himself later referred to as his exit dose, and a collection of poisons at his home, along with meticulous diaries recording dosages administered to individuals, the reactions to the dosage over time, and whether he was going to allow each person to live or die. His trial at St. Albans Crown Court began on June 19, 1972, and lasted 10 days. He was charged with 2 counts of murder, 2 counts of attempted murder, and 2 counts of administering poison. Young pleaded not guilty and claimed that his diary was just fantasy for a novel he was writing. He seemed pretty confident that he would be acquitted since his previous conviction couldn't be entered into evidence. He also thought it would be impossible to identify him as the only person with the means to poison Eglin Biggs. He loved the media attention that surrounded his trial and played into his sinister image. However, he was dubbed the Teacup Poisoner, which he felt belittled his skill and knowledge. Young was found guilty on all the charges and given 4 life sentences. When asked if he felt any remorse over his sadistic killings, he is said to have replied, "What I feel is the emptiness of my soul." While in prison, he befriended fellow serial killer Moore's murderer Ian Brady, with whom he shared a fascination with Nazi Germany. Brady became infatuated with Young, although the attraction was not reciprocated. Brady described Young as genuinely asexual, excited only by power, clinical experimentation, observation, and death. Young died in his cell on August 1, 1990. He was 42 years old. The official cause of his death was heart failure, although many believed that he had grown bored of prison life and poisoned himself in one final gesture of control. And that is the story of Graham Young, the Teacup Poisoner, and if you'd like to hear more stories like that, please subscribe.